Yeah. Thanks,
Awesome.
Christine.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks everyone, and welcome to the 4th episode in our series, The Art and Science of Making Meaningful Moments, Subtle Strategies and Creative Conditions for Effective and Uplifting Facilitation. We're really excited about today's session. I just want to remind you that, just as I mentioned to Megan, we are recording this session, and you can find this session as well as all of our other recorded webinar sessions at interreach.org/webinar archives. And I will drop that into the chat for everybody to go to. Excellent. And then I also wanted to just, there are just so many noises happening on my end. Okay, here we go. I also wanted to just put a pin in our Interreach Reading Club. I am going to share the form for making suggestions for our Interreach Reading Club. So this webinar series happens on the 2nd Tuesday of every month, and on the 4th Tuesday we have our informal reading club, which is really a place for us to unpack literature as well as just kind of talk about best practices. Last month we had a session led by Christine Hendren where we talked about quotes and tools and literature that really supported us individually in our practice of being an arrow. And so we shared those tools with each other, and it was a really phenomenal discussion. And so it's really kind of informal and a place for all of us to really be with each other and create this community of practice. So go ahead, if you have suggestions, please put those in that suggestion form link that I just popped into the chat. So with that, are there any other announcements or things that folks want to add before we get started today? Well, if so, please go ahead and put those in the chat, and we can always get to them at the end. And also another reminder that I want to add is that please remember, if you have time, to join us next week. So same time as this, noon Eastern Standard Time now, in our Interreach office hours. So I included a link for that Zoom room in the announcement that I sent out last week, as well as the reminder that I sent yesterday. So with that, today's session is titled 20 Small but Game-Changing Strategies for Equitable and Inclusive Facilitators. And if you've joined our previous sessions, you may remember our hosts today, Sarah Stevens and Megan Jones. I'm just going to quickly introduce them again and then pass it back over to them for their presentation. So Sarah is a professional experiential educator, longtime team builder, and community engagement specialist. She is a certified MBTI and Clifton Strengths facilitator and is founding Sunny May. She's currently founding Sunny May LLC, her new consulting, coaching, and facilitation business, aimed to deepen creativity and collaboration and enliven individual and collective well-being. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you for your work, and congratulations on your new LLC. Megan is a social scientist and facilitator working in environmental conservation. Her work focuses on helping scientists and practitioners come together to address complex problems, particularly those related to collective action and inclusive leadership. So also thank you, Megan, for that important work. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Megan and Sarah.
Thanks so much, Christine. And thank you all for being here. It's great to have this big crowd of folks here to join us on this important conversation. So we're going to get straight into it with a little bit of overview of what we're going to talk about today. We've structured these 20 small but game-changing strategies into 3 parts. We'll talk about setting a foundation, communicating clearly, and planning holistically. So that will be the kind of backbone of the talk. And we do have closed captioning available if that is helpful for any of you to follow along. So if you are interested in that, you click on the bottom of your screen and you can show subtitles, or you can view the full transcript off on the side. And that's often helpful for folks. I know, Sarah, you find it useful sometimes.
For sure. Rev.com. You will hopefully enjoy it and experience it, and we'll talk about it in a bit. But as a hard of hearing person, I'm a big fan.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. And so we do have this very specific number in our title of 20 strategies. You will see, hopefully you'll get at least that many insights from today as we go through. They're not all cleanly numbered, but we will kind of review at the end. And we've got a PDF to give you that lists them all out. And I'm sure there's more that you could pull out from this that aren't numbered. And we will also give you our slides at the end as a PDF so that that's useful for you afterwards. And we are hoping that you will take advantage of the chat feature on Zoom to make this an interactive endeavor and really crowdsource additional ideas beyond what we're able to, what we're talking about ourselves. We only have 60 minutes together, so there's a lot that we could, beyond what we have built into our slides. And we would normally, as facilitators, make this much more interactive than just a webinar structure, but there will be some opportunities in the chat feature and hopefully towards the end for more discussion as well. So yeah, please share your thoughts and ideas as we go through this. And with that, I'll just jump straight into that first part that I mentioned about how we set the foundations for this kind of equitable, the kind of equitable and inclusive facilitation we are all interested in doing. And we start with a few prereqs here of just baseline assumptions we're making about the room, about you all. We are assuming that you are all coming to this talk as part of a longer term journey that you are on in terms of caring about the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and everything that's caught up in that, and that you have maybe been to other talks about those topics or about anti-racism or justice work in your various fields, so that we're not always going to explain every key term. Hopefully it should be clear, but we're treating this as okay, we've got some familiarity with the ideas. Now, how do we start incorporating this into our practice as that kind of space, and that really focus on tangible things that we can do. And with that said, we are by no means experts. This is not our day job. A little bit about me. I am, like Christine said, I'm a research scientist at Colorado State University, pronouns she, hers. And my work really focuses in the social sciences and environmental conservation spaces. So that's where you'll find me outside of Interreach, working in collective action and inclusive leadership. A lot of my own research has focused on gender and women's leadership. So that's something that I'm particularly interested in. And my facilitation has I've worked a lot on theory of change and conflict resolution and decision making. So not like a DEI expert by any means, but really trying to do this in my own life, and because it makes me a better facilitator and researcher. Sarah has also a little bit to share about herself as context.
All right. Hello, everyone. Yes, so Sarah, she, her, hers. I am more from the community engagement realm and experiential education. So I have background in long ago starting on ropes courses, challenge courses, doing a lot of in-person facilitation, which toward the end, we'll talk a lot about strategies, and I pulled from that and they've evolved over the years. And my expertise, I would say, is team building, a lot with belonging, both community engagement with students that I work with at Colorado State University, as well as community engagement outside of the campus community, a lot with creativity and play. So Christine already mentioned, I have some facilitation background and some personality and strengths-based assessments and tools. But yeah, so that's kind of where I'm coming in from, a more belonging lens, inclusive lens, but doing it in really clever and creative ways.
And Sarah is a fantastically playful person, and a great, I just love how her facilitation skill set is like very different from mine, but very, very valuable in its own way. Speaking of diversity in the room, disciplinary diversity, it's we are a case in point of that, I think, Sarah and I. And in terms of our own journeys and what we bring or don't bring, I've already said that we are not experts. We definitely had some even like feelings of imposter syndrome as we were pulling this talk together, and just, you know, that feeling of anxiety of not wanting to cause harm while trying to talk about ways that we cannot cause harm, or the ways that we can avoid harm. So we are, you know, facilitators in our day jobs, and also researchers and student affairs professionals, respectively. And we have our own stories and lessons and approaches that we're bringing into this space to share with you all. But that's only one or, you know, two different perspectives on this, which is, again, why we want to be really inclusive in the chat feature here as other people bring up insights or ideas. You know, just to state the obvious here, Sarah and I are both white American women. So that means that we have, you know, come up in a particular system around race and white privilege that has created blind spots for us that we are working on re-educating ourselves and learning to see what has been obscured and understand what we are complicit in terms of racism. But that means that we are not, you know, speaking from a position of authority around equity and inclusion when it comes to race and racism specifically, or ethnicity or indigeneity. We're also, you know, women. And as I said, I've done research on gender, and we could have a whole conversation about how gender affects how we show up at in the workplace. I know that I struggle with feelings of perfectionism a lot that is definitely gendered in terms of how I try and do my work. And Sarah, you had a couple of other framings to bring in here.
Yes, I too can side with you on the perfectionism piece, and that's obviously a lot of whiteness is embedded in that as well. And then I already mentioned I'm a bit hard of hearing, and I'll talk a little bit about anxiety and mental health with facilitation. So we're really trying to bring a lot of our identity forward, despite it maybe being an invisible identity.
Absolutely. And one thing that we can share is our own experiences of struggling with this work, which is really important to own, that sometimes we fail when we're trying to be equitable and inclusive facilitators. I have a story to share on this in terms of a recent project that I was helping initiate, where we were really trying to look. This started last year after the George Floyd protests and the focus on Black Lives Matter movement. There was a real effort within the environmental conservation space to grapple with what systems of racism and colonization meant for conservation and nature protection. And I was starting a research project with a collaborator where we were really trying to reflect on a letter that had been written in 1990 from environmental justice activists calling out environmental nonprofits to be more anti-racist. And this was 30 years ago. And it was like, what's changed in 30 years from 1990 to 2020? And we were sending out emails to try and build our partnerships with people and make this a collaborative process. And one of the emails that I sent out, the recipient replied, and he said, like, you're being really hypocritical here. You say you're trying to decolonize conservation, and you are not doing that. This is a colonial research project that you were doing, and you need to really check like how you're thinking about this. And obviously, he was coming from a place of frustration because he's probably like, I'm not the first person he's had to tell that to, and I had to really kind of sit with that and think about what words I use to describe my own involvement in this work, as, my own assumptions about what academia can or can't do, and how academic privilege shapes my own understanding of how we build partnerships, how the kind of power that I wasn't thinking about that I had, and also the totally like unearned lack of trust that I had not earned trust in this relationship in particular. And these are things that we'll come back around to in our strategies, but further on, but just like recognizing that failure moments are a real learning opportunity is a big one. And that certainly stuck with me.
And I too wanted to share, I think especially just to prime the group and own mistakes when we experience them, and then also share these out loud so that hopefully there's a little bit of a ripple effect. If this is something, I don't know, one of you are doing, or have, there's some sort of moment that based off of what we're sharing helps you really reconsider some of the different actions and feelings and thoughts we engage in. So mine is very facilitator related to a group. So like I mentioned, I've been a challenge course instructor for quite a long time, well over a decade. And that spirit animal question, let me tell you, that is a loaded one that if I could tell a story more often, I would, so we can eradicate that darn question and just essentially eliminate a lot of the animalifying, I'm sure that's not a verb, but I will go with that, of facilitation. And so my story is that I did it all too often and for too long, and I didn't assess or consider the impact I was making and the harm I was causing. And my partner is actually from the Big Island of Hawaii, and I didn't even pause to consider until a former colleague of mine who is Native Hawaiian, they called me out big time outside of the group and really educated me. Unfortunately, I had not done it myself, about spirit animals and indigenous peoples. And on top of it, how many different indigenous folks don't choose, but their spirit animal is chosen for them, outside of them. It's a very intensive spiritual practice, and definitely not something white folks should culturally appropriate on top of everything else. And so instead of just fully pivoting and eliminating, I went to another good icebreaker. Somebody recommended, another white person and white dude, in fact. And that was, what is your animal tail? And then I got further feedback that that from a Black person that was saying, oh, okay, so of course I'm going to be ape-like because that's what you're expecting of me to say. And it was really good feedback again in real time, but I really needed to check myself. And so sometimes I think the failure I wanted to share is that just because you see something as good for you, or you like it and it's funny, that doesn't necessarily mean that hasn't perpetuated harm so far. And maybe the identities I hold, it didn't impact, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have a broader impact. And so I've switched to Patronus, but Gen Zers don't know what Harry Potter is, or they don't like Harry Potter. And someone shared with me inner animal. But at the same time, there's just a lot of our past, or what we've seen, that actually doesn't necessarily belong in our practice. And that's my example.
Thanks, Sarah. I think what's clear in both of our stories is that people were generous in their feedback to us about things that we hadn't seen, that we needed to be seeing as people who were trying to hold or create spaces for others to participate in. And we really wanted to start by, we're not going to like ask you all to share stories of failure in this space, but just to kind of give that opportunity for you to think about those experiences you might have had as well. And this comes down to something that is often called the original Big 8 social identities. They're sort of wrapped up in some of these stories we've been telling, like around race in particular. This is a framework that's often used in education spaces in particular, because these identities, I'm sure you've heard people talk about them in other spaces. they're hard to change, if not impossible to change. They're often very visible, although not always. They often are a huge force in how we treat each other, how we understand ourselves, how we treat other people. They're often really central to our identities and who has power or who doesn't. And so it's really important to recognize these and think about them in our facilitation, but they're not the be all and end all, right? Some people talk about the big 17, and I think I added one to this slide, Sarah, so it's even like 18, because indigeneity came up in my story and wasn't explicit on the previous slide, but when it comes to people's identities that are salient to them and really powerful in their own lives, there's many different culturally constructed identities that can be important. And someone might feel that their size and weight is much more important than their gender and how they're treated by other people or how they show up in professional spaces. And there's many more on this page about educational attainment and academic and social achievement, and others, citizenship and language, that can all really structure how people show up and how a group operates when we're facilitating. So trying to go beyond an idea of like a hierarchical approach to identity where there's only 8 things that matter, but really sort of exploding that, making that bigger, and even going beyond these big 17 or 18 to all of the lived identities that each of us, the lived experiences that are caught up in these identities. These aren't like boxes that look the same for every person. We all bring our own experiences of maybe of trauma associated with these identities, of failing to and hurting other people accidentally, of having conflict around this stuff. As someone talked about conflict in the chat just now, different access to technology that shapes whether we can bridge differences across these things. So there's so much richness here to think about that we really invite you to sit with and pull that out in your own work when it comes to being inclusive. But you might also want to try and focus in on things that are most salient in the context that you're working in. So that's another really important piece to this, is to think about what needs that specific individuals in your group might have, particularly if you're trying to have you want to make sure that you make the right accommodations for people. You need to understand what needs they have when it comes to convening and gathering as a group. Sarah will talk more about some of those accommodations later. So that's the individual side of this, and only you know what groups you're working with, and only you can interact, reach out to those people beforehand. But you might also be doing work in a particular context where certain identities or cultural stories are more salient when it comes, for instance, if you're working in STEM and science, there's a whole swath of people who have been excluded from STEM and science work, and it might be really important to focus on those people and centering those people because they have been marginalized in the past. But thinking about what collective issues are most salient and doing the research that the conversations with people beforehand, the broader data collection to just kind of ground yourself in what your needs are in a context. And because these things are so personal to who we are and how we see ourselves and how we interact, this is just a reminder that that classic facilitation technique of setting ground rules is really important when you're trying to be equitable and inclusive. And you can do a lot of good for a lot of different people by having intentional ground rules. Normally, we would set ground rules as facilitators in a very participatory way and really kind of have folks in the room bring these into the space. But I've just listed a couple ideas here for things that feel particularly salient to me when I'm being attentive to issues of equity and inclusion or trying to facilitate space around those topics. That's things like being kind to each other, being empathetic, compassionate, generous, actively listening, deep listening. So you're not just hearing what you're expecting people to say or what you already know or think you know. Being willing to share openly, like we have tried to give you an example of so far, and being respectful when other people share openly. Self-reflecting on yourself and your own, what you bring to this space as well. And Hannah Love, who's a colleague of ours, always says, make sure have fun is in the ground rules, which can feel like not easy if you're working in such difficult issues as equity and inclusion. But I think like have fun learning, have fun, as a group. And that's kind of the goal, that we want this to be a space that people can enjoy when we are facilitating space. And a lot of what we've been getting at here so far relates to this concept of psychological safety, which is something that we can really prioritize as facilitators, is making sure that we are creating psychologically safe spaces for the people in our groups. And this is a concept that's been around for a long time, but is increasingly popular. And you can think about the things that we've already said so far about being willing to take risks and fail, speaking your mind, being openly sharing your struggles, building trust. Some of this we'll talk about in a moment too, ways to do these things. But having that rubric in your mind of, are we prioritizing psychological safety, is really valuable, and just shows how interconnected all of these different strategies are. I've just been talking, Sarah. I haven't really had time to read the chat, but over to you for this slide.
Doing great, Megan. And thanks everyone for contributing. I love that we're teasing out the word failure, and that's really what we want in this session. And as we mentioned, we have so much content to fit into such a small period of time. So the more you can add value added to that chat, go for it and keep digging in. I'm a firm believer in trying to take theory to practice. And so we're going to do that here in a moment. And I try to have engagement every 7 minutes, another good strategy as a facilitator. So I wanted to share a challenge by choice. It might be a concept you're familiar with. Essentially, it comes a little bit more from the adventure learning world. But it is a visual of psychological safety. And so in one way, you can literally consider your feet are in the comfort zone and you're just casual and loose. You can take a step outside. It feels like a good little stretch. You're learning to explore your range. But if you go so far with socks on carpet, you could pull a muscle and regret it. And it's the panic zone. And so I know that's a silly visual, but especially depending on the different types of ages, groups, folks, identities you're working with, it might be good to mix it up. And then virtually, what we're going to do is we want you to, this is anonymous if you choose to do this with Annotate. But if you use the Annotate tool on your screen, if you're on a computer, I found it's in the upper part. You need to kind of hover your mouse over the top part of your screen, and it will say, I'm sharing my screen. And then you can find a way to annotate there. There's also a 3-dot menu you're welcome to do as well. Go to more and click on Annotate. But we're hoping you choose a stamp, any color you want, any shape you want, all good. And then just let us know, where do you fall with this type of topic that we have, equitable and inclusive facilitation? And you can own it if it's something that you feel expert in, if it's something that you're reflecting your learning and your interests, so be it. Look at this. Beautiful. I said anonymous, but I didn't realize it showed your name. So no one's looking at all. Thank you for adding. We appreciate it. Annotate is an awesome tool with facilitation to do in real time. You don't have to go to another software. So thank you for entertaining that. Let's turn this off. I've lost my capability. Megan, can you wipe the screen so we don't carry these annotates on to the next slide?
I will do my very best, but Annotate, it's, I think clear all drawings.
Yes.
Right.
All right. Solid. If you don't, you're going to have all those beautiful stars all over the place.
I definitely, speaking of much more minor failures, facilitated a webinar where I forgot that annotate was turned on and people just kept, I was talking and they just kept writing little squiggles totally accidentally as they were trying to move their own mouse. So just here to review what we've talked about in part one so far. These are some of the strategies that we mentioned that we would give you a list if you like lists. I like lists. But as you are sharing in the chat, there is more here than just the list in terms of what we can pull out from this. I'm also going to just share here in the chat a link to a PDF of all of the different strategies that we have collated. And I really like the discussion around failure that's happening in the chat in terms of, what is failure? Is failure failing to do what you intended to do? Or is it failure is failing to learn from when you make a mistake? I think those are two important components of this conversation. We still have some annotations happening, Sarah, on the screen. I don't know if it's possible to turn that off or how we deal with that, but I'm glad that people were able to make annotate work for them. And so that is the end of our first part. And now we're going to transition to part two around communicating clearly and some strategies related to that when Sarah is able to take that over.
Awesome. One concept I wanted to add real quick based off of what's transpiring in the chat is that at Colorado State, the health network uses a concept called failing forward. And so I think a lot of what's transpiring in the chat is a really good definition of a different reframe. All right, let's get into strategy and application and ways in which you can really bring this to life. So what's going to come next is a lot of content, ideas, again, tease it out, give us a lot more, that if you make these adjustments, it will subconsciously, honestly impact everyone, but it will be very life-changing for particular identities. It might change one person's ability to feel like they are more connected and have gained a sense of belonging. And so sure, it might really impact one, but it also is a very all-encompassing approach. So worth it always. Of course, I could share a lot of data and go into peer-reviewed articles and share all that, but I do love a good quote. And so just wanted to kind of baseline knowledge it up for you all for if you need a quick refresher or want to see how others have reframed and defined diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And I really particularly like the quote in the bottom right corner that has to do with all these different ones that we're going to cover here in a moment really shouldn't be add-ons. If you can think of ways to integrate them in at the beginning, how much more of a seamless flow it can be. And then it doesn't necessarily other or individualize it for certain folks, but in the end, it's very all-encompassing. All right, so let's talk about visual comprehension. So different ways to go about it. I'm just going to kind of pop around and give you a lot of different concepts to think about. And I would challenge yourself to think of maybe which ones have done those, and others I'm going to need to look into. Hannah, I'm glad you love this. This is solid, but reduce that annotate there. That would be great. All right, so color blindness. My partner is colorblind. There is red, green, and yellow, blue. So just thinking of how you present content on your page, a lot of presentations can look really pretty, but at the same time, it can be really detracting. So color is not the only conveyor of information. Mindful backlining, neutral background. As a facilitator, having some virtual background on display is really distracting for folks. And so just keep it simple for yourself. Learn this from the Career Center at CSU. Italics on your resume make the employer not look at what's in your resume, but bold and underline is what brings it to the surface. Tiny little detail that I had not ever considered. You can always turn on accessibility tracker in PowerPoint, all sorts of Microsoft, what is it called? Office software, and then Google, a lot of different softwares have it, but it will let you know what images you don't actually have alternative text for. And if you're doing a transcription reader for folks that have inability to see and are utilizing different technology, It only took me about 12 minutes to add it to the slides, and absolutely worth it. So a few visual comprehensions to consider. Other things, visual variations. So I'm a big fan of unsplash.com, which is where the image on the right came from. It is full of stock photos that you're welcome to use, some for a price, others free, as long as you give credit. And I would also recommend using your own images. It's really easy if you're using graphics, especially very like clip art graphics of Word that feel like 1990s, or even newer graphics out there. Keep in mind that a lot of it is just black and white. And so in fact, you might put a person on screen, but it's perceived as a white person. And so really considering group representation, you don't want to other or tokenize folks and not overdo it, but having a balanced representation for the folks that you are at least expecting, and if not expecting, getting ahead of, so that there's not a just pervasive whiteness on screen. One thing to note though is the image I chose at first on the right, I thought, oh, this is so inclusive, but then it says we stand here. And so that's a little able-bodied. So you can, again, make some mistakes, failures, however we want to define that word. Mercator misconception. Another thing about visuals is that if you're bringing maps into the fold, think about what the point of view you're showing, how that could be, for instance, very US centric. A lot of globes that people show really focus in on North America. And this is actually showing that the way that maps are built, especially for the last 500 years, really made certain areas, all of those colonizers gave them a lot more attention and built it up so that they're bigger, stronger, have a greater presence. And so really, I would say explore your images and double check them. And there's a lot of visuals that can really turn folks off and create harm on screen, and you've lost your audience. All right, let's talk about Rev. So going on to audio, we're using rev.com. I am definitely not trying to sell you on Rev. However, as a hard of hearing person that utilizes closed captioning subtitles all the time, personally, I feel like it is the closest thing to perfection that I have experienced or found. A lot of well-known channels, NBC, ABC, whatever, they're utilizing Rev as well. And so it's a very reliable source. It's not too expensive, $20 per month, depending on what your funding source is. But I did just want to clarify, since you have the chance to experience it, and if you haven't turned it on yet, you can just give it a go on your screen to kind of get a sense of, it might not get my words correct per se at the start, but it actually goes back with AI technology and adjusts it. So utilizing Rev, other closed captioning really enables you to, yes, be more productive because folks are better understanding, and you can have a little bit more of a global impact. And they work with, I think, about 20 different languages. Other auditory adjustments you can make. If you are considering auditory ability disability, it's not just for folks that are hard of hearing. There could be fluency, accents, a lot of components to it. I'll show PowerPoint here in a moment, but if you want the free version, but you have Microsoft Office, I know Google Slides has this now too. There's a lot of closed captioning you can add to your own slides. I would challenge you if your first thought is, oh, we can't afford this. I mean, a lot of the stuff you own, if you actually maximized its potential, likely there's closed captioning within it. And so more, I think the question is, can you afford people to not understand? Not can you afford the software or not? And oh, heck yeah. I'm not even looking much in the chat, but I love the URLs that are being shared. So yeah, if you have any good resources other than the ones, Interact Streamer is another one. It's made by folks who are hard of hearing. Lip reading, I'm relying on that. And so masks are really hard. And when people cover their mouth, I only catch about every third word. So enunciating, slowing down, considering background noise, partners making a smoothie downstairs, I can tell. So if my sound just got real crappy, that is why. And I have exemplified what not to do. Clap once if you can hear me. In some ways that could be ageism based as well, but just really considering things that maybe you gleaned from 40 years ago, is it really the best source for getting folks' attention today? Other nice thing is you can always record it by using Rev. I have this recording on screen. So if you checked out this recording later, the closed captioning is already there. You don't have to upload it to YouTube and then add closed captioning in. So there's a lot of tricks of the trade that you can do to make things way more accessible that can make a really large difference. So if you were going to do it on PowerPoint, you would have to have one of the newer versions of PowerPoint. You can do it on Mac, Windows. Chrome is best for web. But you can even go to up to 60 different languages, which I just learned this morning, which is pretty wild and awesome. And putting the closed captioning below is so valuable to someone who is reading closed captioning and reading your slides. If you put it overlaid, I can't read the bottom of your slides ever. So it's just the tiniest little things that can make a big difference. All right.
Before
Activities.
before we get into that, Sarah, so Lee in the chat just said, what's an alternative to clap once if you can hear me?
Ooh, we are getting there. We are getting there. Yes. You can, my most effective one is actually to stop talking. Now that is not helpful because that doesn't help with auditory. So that helps with maybe the kindergarten feel. What are some ideas? Put them in the chat. I've seen teachers use really like absurd looking things they're holding up in their hand. And then that visual while doing something auditory covers a lot of ground, but I'd be happy to hear others for sure. Multiple language options. Okay, so yeah, while you have closed captioning on, if you're, even actually Megan might be able to give more context because you work with more folks from different countries when you converse with them through presentations and talks.
Yeah, I think so. I've seen it done once in a webinar where there was live translation. So that's slightly more intense than we're talking about here, but they talked about language justice and how if you're truly trying to reach people who are not just the folks who are fluent in the dominant language, that you can think about these alternative ways to get simultaneous translation of some kind in. I haven't used the rev.com feature with across languages, but I know that it's possible in Zoom to have, as you said, as Amanda said in the chat, there's live translation features in Zoom, which can include having someone who's on a separate channel in Zoom who's live translating or typing in a chat. So there's there's a full transcript in another language. Just something to think about if you're facilitating across cultures or countries, or if your team is multinational and you're sometimes working in with a team based in France and a team based in the US or something like that.
All righty, let's move on to names. So to be inclusive and equitable as a facilitator, honestly, I'm going to fast forward one slide really quick. Use their favorite word. People might despise their name. They wish said parent didn't give them said middle name, and they don't even want to bring it up. But at the end of the day, if you remember something about them, even if it's not their name, but that name piece, that makes them feel like they matter. They were remembered. They have a greater sense of belonging. And so let's go back to annotate. If you could, instead of stamping, I mean, if you want to stamp, so be it. But if you could actually do the text tool and go ahead on this screen and share what is your best way to remember names. And even if you feel like you don't remember, what you've heard might work best. Don't discredit yourself. I bet in some circumstances, you're probably stronger at it than others. Ask them how to spell it. Oh gosh, I didn't mean to annotate right next to that. Start with the name. Name story, yes, bringing a narrative to context gives you a few things to have as association. Writing them down. Yeah, so writing it out, letters, and then phonetically adding to it. That's a good one. What else? Go around the circle. Repetition. Repetition is huge, whether it's one-on-one, then you bring up the name 3 times. Thank you, Megan, for sharing. Megan, are you ready to go on to the next slide? It can get sometimes a little condescending, so not over the top there. Repeating, checking. Look the person up to get more context. Contextual information is huge when learning names. Say it out loud, repeatedly. Yes, the writing, memorization of writing, not just saying, and vice versa, varying how you actually interact with the name.
I've also found if I have the list beforehand, YouTube videos on how to pronounce a name, or, you know, Googling the name beforehand helps me.
Faces, context. Yes, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to clear them. I'm not anti all your contributions, but this next slide, it will become a little redundant, so I'll keep it short. If I could get my mouse to come back. Whoops, well. Great, one moment. My mouse has disappeared from the program. Okay, well, Megan, give your best tips for remembering names for a moment while I try to fix this.
We can also stop screen sharing for a second if you'd like.
Could you stop it? I cannot control the screen. Yes.
Absolutely. I'm going to stop you screen sharing, and then
Perfect.
we'll go back in.
Okay, I will say, having shared my screen a lot during presentations, depending on the capacity of your computer, closed captionings can really take a toll on your capabilities. So desktop, if you can, is even better. Awesome. So you all covered this: word, appearance, association, name narratives. If you only saw this amount of view of folks you know well, family, friends, colleagues, you'll actually be able to identify them individually because eyes are so expressive. So really making eye contact, the person who mentioned looking at a face, that is huge if you can have the expressive eyes. It's cool to ask for pronunciation for a period of time, but don't overdo it. That can really start to other people, especially because their name is different than something you're more familiar with. Instead, where I work with an office of a lot of students, with a lot of international students and students of color, everybody, even Kevin, even Chad writes their pronunciations on their name tag. So we just role model it and set it up from the start. Similarly with pronouns, instead of just forcing it, you could say, if you'd like to share pronouns, and then you could model it, Sarah, she, her, hers. It's okay if folks don't do it, but if you model it, you can kind of set the tone through observational learning. You can always change your name on Zoom. First name, she, her. For me, I could have done that. You can do a lot with your Zoom name tag. But the big thing here is give yourself contextual clues to help you through even a short period of time. And if you're going to see folks again, do more of the added layers and contextual piece that can go on just from a quick little Zoom name tag screenshot. Based off of time, I'm only going to cover a little bit here. So keep in mind ableist language, the clap if you can hear me, stand up if. As someone that has anxiety, I do take offense to the whole insane, crazy, don't worry about it language. Even wild has been in place of that, but that might be seen as offensive as well. You're going to struggle with your words and cycle through it and learn. But you can say, maybe you don't need to say any of those words because those aren't actually the descriptive word you're looking for. So really trying to think of other synonyms to capture people's attention. Okay, let's all come together. Join us now now it would be a good time to join us. So you can really use a lot of terminology that doesn't rely on the senses, that helps people feel a little bit more able to join in and included. Similarly, reducing violent language. Gen Z loves the killed it slang and a bunch of other slang words that really emphasize violence, and we just accept it in our US society. And instead, even like finger guns, We had a student that was at the Aurora shooting in Colorado and took major offense to icebreaker activities where this symbol was used versus something more like a shark image. So you can really consider your nonverbals. Okay, hand gesture out of context is a symbol of hate for white supremacist groups. Peace sign, thumbs up. Megan is a dual citizen, and I know she has a whole different understanding for the peace sign in United Kingdom versus.
Depends. Difference between that and that is cultural. So I mean, some of this stuff, it's hard, right? You can't get everything right all the time, but just noting that they might be different.
Yeah, so just trying to get you again to research the folks that you're working with. And the more, I think the violent language one, the more it's on the top of your mind in your everyday speak, you'll start to notice that it is very pervasive in our society. So finding ways to eliminate it, to not truly literally be triggering to folks that the violence piece is too much.
Again, in the interest of time, I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I encourage you, for you podcast listeners, check out this code switch episode about the explanatory comma. What we choose to explain or what we choose to not explain says a lot about who we assume is in the room and who we are centering in our work and who we are marginalizing. And it's really important that people understand, but also if you explain things, that assumes that they are not the center of the conversation. So getting that balance right. Also, what you assume, I've worked, I had a facilitation training I was leading where one of the, in Kenya, where one of the executives, leaders of the nonprofit was illiterate because he left school. He was a traditional herder. Like, I had assumed that people could read, and I had to completely redesign my training to be, around that, which was such a good wake up call. Or whether you ask people to read out loud, what language you use around, like, of course, as you know, or as I'm sure you're familiar with. That just assumes that people have an understanding that might make them feel small if they don't know that thing, particularly if you're working across disciplines, or if you're working with people who have different levels of educational attainment. So a lot of this stuff is just about checking your assumptions about who's in the room. And so really to summarize here in section 2, we've talked a lot about, Sarah's talked about visuals and audio, closed captioning, the language we use, how we talk about names, and our assumptions about how people can follow along. Even things like slowing down speech if you're working across cultures or across linguistic groups, to really take that time to just enunciate a little bit more and not really rapid fire run through it like we've been doing a little bit with some of these things, perhaps because we want to get you all the content that we could. Sarah, I'm aware that we have 5 minutes left, so maybe we can just hit on a couple of these big things in section 3. And as a reminder, we will be sending out a PDF of our slides along with that PDF of the 20 strategies. I think we could just skip to trust sequencing as one, and maybe navigating conflict and power.
Yeah, so we're clearly right up against this time. We really do have office hours, and it'd be great if you wanted to join us and we could go into finer detail if you're interested. My recommendation for any sort of activities is you start small, individual dyads, then small group, then large group. Perceive risk as low. It will never actually be risk that you are applying to activities, but that trust fall, or whether that's mental, emotional, or physical, definitely does not come at the start. I included some sequencing to consider when you're doing retreats or meetings, or you're trying to build that sense of team, and keeping in mind people really come in from different head and heart spaces. And so starting small to build up. I included some different ways, the 5 essentials of icebreakers, another way to kind of frame that beginning piece of the sequence. Go ahead.
I just wanted to, as we're thinking about reflecting back on everything we've talked about today and everything that we could have talked with this, someone early on in the comments brought up conflict. if we're talking about trying to be equitable and inclusive, we have to recognize that we're gonna fail. People in our group are gonna fail. We might have differences of opinion about what's the right thing to do. We're going to get into spaces of conflict, and it's not always going to be comfortable. Someone in the chat talked about brave and safe spaces. You know, discomfort is a powerful place for learning if it's not the panic zone, as Sarah said. So, you know, good facilitators work on their conflict management skills their whole careers, I think, and just recognizing this as a skill set that can be really important when you're getting into these profoundly personal and difficult things that we're all on a learning journey for.
Real quick, in person, just keep in mind sunglasses. It feels like a power dynamic. Lighting and fragrance really can impact migraines. You say get in a circle, so squares you can't see the corners of, and when people are sitting in front of each other, it's not that spacing that really is inclusive. Closed off posture, really keeping in mind how you actually have an open presence. And if you are asking questions as the facilitator, people will always look back at you. Look into the center of the circle and not make eye contact with the speakers so they actually start to look at each other. Considering your power dynamic, make chairs available. Some folks can't stand for long periods of time. Sitting, standing, it's okay as long as you're not standing and everyone else is below you. So some other in-person considerations. You can check out the inclusive recognition piece. Lots of ways to do it without actually creating harm, but a lot of the tried and true practices, I don't think really consider, having been the last picked person, how the impact can be created where you feel like you weren't a part of the group, while all the extroverts, talkative folks with maybe dominant identities really get a lot of early praise. So since we're at time, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You're welcome to write something really quick, or Megan can sign us off.
So, well, let's just come back to this. This is a great, this is a reflection tool. If you don't have to run to another meeting, you can think about in the chat, sharing a head or a heart or a hand or a feet thing about something that you thought from today, some feelings that this brought up, any tools that you're walking away with in your hands, or any next steps that you're going to take for personal action from this stuff. I find this really helpful for trying to sum up reflection as a whole group when I'm doing that, helping people synthesize on their learning. So we'd love if you're able to share that in the chat, anything here to synthesize that. I know people are having to log off because we've literally run up against the time, but here's one last slide of some of the things that we briefly touched in not part 2, part 3, typo there, about how to think about the holistic planning of your facilitation to be prepared to navigate conflict and power dynamics, sequence activities to build trust, match icebreakers to the group's needs, and just keep learning, as we hope that you will continue to do, and that this seminar has helped with your learning journeys. It's certainly been fun for Sarah and I to try and hone in on what exactly it is that we're trying to do in our own practice. So we will be, as Sarah said, doing office hours the same time next Tuesday. There will be a different Zoom link for that. We'd love to continue the conversation. And there will, you can also reach out to us via email so that we can do some one-on-one conversation. And last but not least, some of our amazing colleagues will be doing a webinar on a different but related topic about compassionate and resilient communities in the same time in a month. So thank you all so much for your time and attention. And we really hope to continue the conversation in other spaces.
No, we're over time, but if you all have a few moments to stick around for Q&A, we could do a couple questions really quickly, but if you've got to go, we understand.
I'm also going to save the chat feature just because I saw there were a couple links there that we will make sure to try and get back around. If anyone has anything they want to share aloud, feel free to just unmute or and ask anything.
Yeah, actually, I have a question. Something we've been debating about is sequencing. You talked about starting with smaller groups, moving into larger ones. So I don't know if you were talking about in person or virtual, because in virtual spaces, we have felt like 2 is not a safe space, that we can't ensure that's a safer, I would say safer space for the folks, especially as people we haven't, if we're just starting a new PLC, for example. So I was just curious what your thoughts were around that, and if you could tell me more about the sequencing that went into the slide here.
Yeah, gosh, I know. I wish I could have gone so much more into this. We packed so much into this session. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, when you're doing virtual, everybody's on screen in that mosaic form, and then you don't, it really comes down to the amount of time you have. I think so many people skip over introductions, even a simple, I don't know, I always try to do something that's, I don't know, it gives context. It really helps with similarities, but again, that whole celebratory piece of differences, but it's something that's like grounding at the start. So many people bypass that step and then throw you into a breakout room, and then there's no context, and then there's nothing, you don't know what to do because they didn't structure the breakout room without adding to the chat first. So my tips would be, you don't have to do dyads. I think in person it's a little bit easier, but you could do dyads, triads, small group. I would do a little bit more priming of the group first. And if you're going to give them a topic to go deeper into before going there, I would give them some prompts and I'd copy and paste it into the chat. I've definitely made the mistake of not doing that first, and then you can't communicate with people other than the 10-second little blue chat box. But yeah, that might help. You could also be really strategic about your grouping. Like if you know folks, you can split up the clickiness. And then the other thing I would say is observational learning is huge. Albert Bandura's theory, pick the people that'll take it seriously and place one of them in each of the groups, and then almost appoint them to start, just so the person that's apathetic and will derail the conversation doesn't do that from the start. And then you don't actually make the most out of your small group.
Thank you. I really appreciate that thinking through, because I think that's definitely, we have so many more tools in our facilitator that we've tried out so many new things with the virtual world. And so it's kind of like, what do we keep? What do we try out? What do we try differently? The word pivot, I suppose, like the word of 2020 and 21.
Yeah.
And yeah, but thank you so much. I really appreciate this today. Thanks.
You're welcome. Yeah, I'm a part of Association of Experiential Educators, and they are so good at this. And yet we do breakout rooms all the time and nobody knows each other. So even the best of us can just make that assumption and skip over it. And it's so darn awkward for the rest of us. So.
Yeah, I've really found that just priming people that there will be breakout groups, like, hey, be prepared that we might, we're going to ask you to speak aloud. People don't expect that all the time in webinar format. Giving people written instructions that they can refer back to for the conversation, and having, if you can, like an actual facilitator in each group for the first time to help build those participatory norms and hold the space, because it's just not there online otherwise without some of the stuff that Sarah was talking about as well.
All right, some of you've stayed on, so maybe there was a reason you had a question, comment. We'll take feedback, open to it.
Hi, great presentation. I have a question about, I think something as it relates to facilitation in contexts like these, especially around inclusion. I'm interested to hear more maybe around, I think as a facilitator, one concept is really power. And as a facilitator, you've got power over process a little bit. And how do you approach that, either transparently communicating about what power you might have? I see that here, but to even acknowledge up at the top, like I'm a facilitator, I've got this power, and either reducing that to some extent. I don't know what responsibility you feel like you necessarily have in this context.
I mean, like exactly what you were saying, just to own that there are power dynamics in the room and that you are part of it as a facilitator from just at that initial level of recognizing that and having that conversation. I think I think can be really important depending on the team. And it can be really small of role modeling, power sharing when you're starting, and just calling out to like, I'm starting by doing a lot of the talking, and, but we're creating this space for ourselves as a group. This is not my space, this is our space. And we're going to really focus on pivoting to a more hearing more voices than mine as we go on. And here's how we're going to do that. And we're not just going to be doing that, in a big group. We're going to be doing that in smaller groups as well, thinking back to in-person facilitation. Sarah, what other ideas do you have? You've pulled back to this slide for a reason, I think.
Yeah, I know this slide was really like, here's some technical things, but your question is a bit broader. I think owning it, I think it really comes down to your group and their goals and your role connected to them. Are you a teacher? Are you a trainer? Are you a facilitator? Are you an outsider, insider? And of course, that's like a big part of it. If you're more internal to the group, you might have some true goals that you really do need them to get to. If you're an outsider, you were hired in, there might be goals you're still supposed to get to by the person that drew you in and expecting a certain return. But at the end of the day, I remember I did an 8-hour-long facilitation for a group called Agricultural Ambassadors at CSU. And I had this whole thing planned. I did a heck of a lot of like front work, 15 hours worth with their advisor and their presidents and all that. And we only got through 1 of 10 activities. And it was so clear that the group had completely different agenda than all the leadership. And their agenda was they had no sense of identity, a collective identity. And they spent so long coming up with their mission for 1-sentence mission. And that was so much more important to them. So I think like this willingness to derail your agenda, and even like saying that out loud so they know that they have ownership and can advocate for themselves. And as long as you feel that that's productive, and maybe the end goal was this like tight cohesion, and maybe instead that's that manifested through that activity, despite all the activities you had planned. I don't know if that.
Yeah, one other thought you just gave me, Sarah, is about having space structured in for the group to set an agenda through some sort of, halfway through. We've talked about a lot of different things. What do we need to focus on more? And having like Post-its up on a wall where people prioritize things they want to talk about, and that space is deliberately left. That's just like one small thing to try and address a power imbalance as well. And there's some great comments in the chat as well on this. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Yeah, one of the activities you kind of alluded to, I call agenda dots. And so you could put all the potential topics up, and they use like the garage sale stickers, the multicolor ones, and they can apply that to the topics that are most interest. And as long as you're capable of being able to still bring those topics to light and explore them, I think there's a huge dynamic shift there. They got ownership of their session.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to add any final questions?
And if you think of things during the week, because I know I always leave a seminar and go, oh, I missed that. Join them for office hours. Well, I'll probably be there too. Join us for office hours. This is my Zoom link next week, and we can chat more.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you all for such a rich conversation and for sticking around to the end. It's been really enjoyable to talk about this.
Yeah, appreciate it. Take care, everyone. All right.
See you later, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah.